She found the second phone in the pocket of his golf bag, tucked inside a sock, the way a teenager hides something from a parent. Not a husband hiding something from a wife of 22 years. A phone with one contact saved in it. Not a name. Just 3 letters, HM, home, and under that contact, 311 text messages, the most recent one sent 4 hours earlier, while she was in the next room plating his dinner. It read, "Tell her happy birthday from her daddy. I miss you both." Rachel Whitfield stood in her walk-in closet, bigger than the apartment she grew up in, holding a stranger's phone that belonged to her husband, and for the first time in 22 years of marriage, she asked herself a question she never thought she'd have to ask. Who is my husband? Because the man downstairs, the man who built a $400 million logistics empire from a single delivery truck, the man who kissed her goodnight every single night like clockwork, had another child, a son, 9 years old, and a woman who had raised that boy for almost a decade, 20 minutes away, in a house Rachel had never seen, funded by money Rachel had helped him earn. She would later say that the sound in her ears that night wasn't crying, it was silence. A silence so total it felt like her own heartbeat had stopped to listen. Because somewhere in that silence, underneath the fear and the humiliation, was a colder thought creeping in, one she wasn't ready to face yet. If he could hide a child for 9 years, what else had he hidden, and what was he capable of doing to her, now that she knew? This is the story of Rachel Whitfield, a story about a marriage built on trust, and a betrayal built in secret, brick by brick, for almost a decade. A story about the moment a woman realizes the life she built might have been someone else's blueprint all along. Stay with me until the end, because what Rachel discovers in the final months of this story will change how you think about loyalty, about money, and about the quiet strength of a woman the world underestimated. But to understand how she got to that closet, holding that phone, we have to go back to the beginning, back to a version of Rachel who believed, with her whole heart, that she had found the one man in the world who would never do this to her. Betrayal. That's just 20 years of marriage. She had no idea, not the faintest suspicion, that 400 miles away, in a small coastal town Daniel visited quarterly for a supposed warehouse expansion project, there was a woman named Melissa Cross. A woman Daniel had met at a logistics conference 11 years into his marriage to Rachel. A woman who, unlike Rachel, had never known Daniel when he was poor. A woman who only ever knew him as successful, powerful, generous with money, in a way that felt, to a woman 15 years younger than him, intoxicating. And she had absolutely no idea that 2 years into that affair, Melissa Cross gave birth to a baby boy. A boy Daniel named, in a private moment of guilt and sentimentality that would have broken Rachel's heart in half had she known, after his own late father. A boy who was, at the time Rachel finally found that phone in the golf bag, 9 years old. Enrolled in a private school Daniel paid for in cash transfers, routed through a shell account, living in a house Daniel had purchased under his business partner's name, calling another man uncle at school events, because Daniel could never risk being seen there himself. For 9 years, Daniel Whitfield lived 2 entire lives. In one life, he was the devoted husband, the doting father to Emily and Caleb, the man who showed up to every school play, every soccer game, who still, even in his 50s, held Rachel's hand in restaurants, like they were still that young couple who couldn't afford a honeymoon. In the other life, 400 miles away, he was building a second family, celebrating a second set of birthdays, telling a second woman that she was the one he truly loved, that Rachel was simply the marriage he couldn't leave without losing everything. And somewhere in between those two lives, unaware of either version fully, Rachel Whitfield kept doing what she had always done. She kept building the home. She kept raising the children. She kept believing, with the same quiet faith she'd had since she was 26 years old answering phones for $9 an hour, that the man she married was exactly who he appeared to be. Romantic. Instead, Rachel remembers feeling a strange hollowness she couldn't explain, sitting across from her husband of 20 years at a candlelit table, watching him raise his glass to toast their marriage, and feeling, for just a fraction of a second, like she was watching an actor perform a role rather than a man speaking from his heart. She dismissed the feeling immediately. She told herself she was being paranoid, ungrateful even, for questioning a man who had just spent thousands of dollars to celebrate her. She had no way of knowing that 4 days before that anniversary trip, Daniel had spent the weekend in Brantwood at his son's 7th birthday party, wearing a paper crown the boy had made for him, promising the child that soon, things were going to be different. Soon they wouldn't have to hide anymore. He had been making that same promise for years by then. He would keep making it for 2 more. The most painful warning sign, the one Rachel would return to again and again in the months after everything came apart, involved their son Caleb, who was 16 at the time. Caleb had always idolized his father, had spent his childhood in the passenger seat of Daniel's truck riding along on warehouse visits, had chosen to study business partly because he wanted, someday, to run Whitfield Logistics alongside him. One evening, Caleb came home upset after seeing his father's car, unmistakably, parked outside a restaurant in a town Caleb didn't recognize. On a night Daniel had told the family he was working late at the office. Caleb didn't say anything to his father. He said it to his mother, quietly, uncertain, the way teenagers voice suspicions they desperately hope will be proven wrong. Rachel remembers the exact words. "Mom, I think I saw Dad's car somewhere weird. Probably nothing though, right?" And Rachel, God help her, she would say later, looked her own son in the eye and told him it was probably nothing. She told him that a man like his father, running a company with operations across 6 states, could be anywhere for 100 legitimate reasons. She told her son this not because she fully believed it, but because believing anything else meant confronting a version of her life she was not yet ready to face. She would carry the guilt of that moment, of dismissing her own child's instincts to protect her own denial, longer than almost any other guilt from this entire story. It is worth pausing here to say something important, something Rachel herself would come to understand only much later. With the help of a therapist she began seeing after everything fell apart. The warning signs were never subtle because Rachel was foolish, or naive, or willfully blind. They were subtle because Daniel Whitfield was, by that point, exceptionally skilled at deception. 9 years of practice will do that to a person. Every excuse had been tested. Every alibi had been refined. He had built his double life with the same meticulous discipline he'd used to build his company, brick by brick, contingency by contingency, and Rachel was not fighting against her own blindness. She was fighting against a system specifically designed, over years, to keep her blind. But systems, even carefully built ones, have failure points. And 2 months before Rachel would find that second phone in the golf bag, the first true failure point appeared. Small and seemingly insignificant, the way all failure points do before they bring the entire structure down. It happened at a company holiday party, the kind of lavish event Whitfield Logistics threw every December for its 400 employees and their families. Rachel was working the room the way she always did, gracious, warm, remembering the names of drivers' wives and warehouse managers' children, the unofficial first lady of a company she had helped build from nothing. And in the middle of that party, a young woman from the accounting department, new, nervous, clearly having had one glass of wine too many, approached Rachel with a strange, searching look on her face. "Mrs. Whitfield," the young woman said, "I'm so sorry. This is probably nothing, but I process some of the vendor payments, and I keep seeing this one account that Mr. Whitfield always tells me to route personally instead of through the normal system. Coastal Property Holdings. I just wanted to check. Is that a real vendor? Because I can't find any invoices for it." Rachel felt something cold move through her chest, a feeling she wouldn't be able to name for another 2 months, not until she was standing in her closet holding a stranger's phone. She smiled at the young woman, told her not to worry, that she would look into it personally, and she meant it. That night, driving home from the party, with Daniel laughing beside her about some story a warehouse manager had told him, Rachel Whitfield made a quiet decision that would change the rest of her life. She decided, for the first time in 22 years of marriage, to stop trusting her husband's explanations and start looking for the truth herself. It took Rachel exactly 11 weeks to find the truth, and she found it not through some dramatic act of detective work, but through the same patient, methodical discipline she had used decades earlier to balance the books of a company with 3 trucks and no accountant. She started small. She requested access to the company's vendor records, something she was fully entitled to as a longtime informal advisor to the business, even without her name on any official paperwork. She found that Coastal Property Holdings LLC had received over $94,000 in the past 2 years alone, all approved personally by Daniel, all routed around the standard accounts payable process. She didn't confront him, not yet. Instead, she did something that surprised even herself, something the old Rachel, the trusting, unquestioning Rachel of 22 years, would never have imagined doing. She hired a private investigator, a quiet, discreet woman named Grace Okafor, recommended by a lawyer friend from Rachel's charity board, someone who specialized, delicately, in exactly this kind of situation. Grace called Rachel 3 weeks later with an update that Rachel would remember for the rest of her life, not because of what was said, but because of the careful, professional gentleness in Grace's voice, the voice of someone who had delivered this kind of news many times before and had learned, out of necessity, how to deliver devastation as softly as devastation can be delivered. "Mrs. Whitfield," Grace said, "I need you to sit down for this." Coastal Property Holdings LLC, it turned out, owned a single asset, a 4-bedroom house in Brantwood, purchased 6 years earlier, registered under the name of Daniel's longtime business partner, Frank Delgado, but paid for entirely through funds traced back to Whitfield Logistics accounts that Daniel controlled personally. The house's utility bills, its property tax records, its homeowners association fees, all of it, led back to one occupant. A woman named Melissa Cross, 38 years old, and a boy named Adrian Cross, 9 years old, enrolled at Brantwood Academy, a private school 40 minutes from the house. Grace had photographs. She asked Rachel, gently, if she wanted to see them now or wait. Rachel said now. She would later say she doesn't remember making that decision consciously. Her mouth simply said the word, before her mind had fully processed what she was agreeing to see. The photographs showed Daniel, Unmistakably Daniel, in jeans and a t-shirt Rachel had never once seen him wear, standing in a backyard Rachel had never seen, pushing a boy who had Daniel's exact jawline, Daniel's exact laugh, visible even frozen in a photograph, on a swing set. Another photograph showed Daniel and Melissa Cross at what appeared to be a birthday party, Daniel's arm around her waist with the same easy familiarity he used with Rachel, the same practiced comfort of a man who had done this 1,000 times and felt, in that moment, completely at home. Rachel did not cry when she saw those photographs. She would later describe the feeling as something closer to falling, the specific, stomach-dropping sensation of missing a stair in the dark. Except the stairs kept going, and there was no floor to land on, just an endless sense of falling through everything she thought she knew about her own life. She spent the next 4 days in a strange, methodical fog, gathering every document Grace could provide, printing bank statements, saving photographs, building what she would later describe, without any bitterness in her voice, as a case file, like I was building evidence against a stranger who happened to be living in my house. She did not tell Daniel what she knew. She did not tell her children. She told no one except Grace, and, eventually, a divorce attorney named Patricia Alvarez, recommended by the same friend who had recommended Grace, a woman known throughout the state for representing spouses in complex, high-asset divorces involving hidden wealth. Patricia Alvarez asked Rachel one question in their first meeting that would haunt Rachel for months afterward. "Mrs. Whitfield, is your name on the deed to your house? On the company? On any of the major assets?" Rachel said no. It had never seemed necessary. They were married. Everything was theirs. Together. In the way she had always understood marriage to mean sharing. Patricia's face, professionally composed as it was, flickered with something Rachel recognized immediately as concern. "We're going to need to move very carefully," Patricia said, "and very quickly." It was during the process of building this case, during a Tuesday afternoon while Daniel was traveling, supposedly on a business trip to inspect a warehouse in Tennessee, that Rachel found herself standing in the closet, holding his golf bag, looking for a specific tax document Grace had asked her to locate. And that is when she found the second phone, tucked into a sock, the phone that would become the final, undeniable piece of evidence, the phone with 311 messages between Daniel and Melissa spanning back over 4 years. She read every single message, all 311 of them. She read about Adrian's first day of kindergarten, about a fever that had frightened Melissa one night when Daniel couldn't come because Rachel had scheduled a family dinner he couldn't get out of. She read Daniel telling Melissa, 7 months earlier, "I know this isn't fair to you. I'm going to fix it. I promise you, by the time Adrian turns 10, we'll be a real family, out in the open." She read Melissa's reply, "You've been saying that since he was 5. And there, in that message, in Melissa Cross's frustrated, weary response to a promise she'd clearly heard many times before, Rachel found something she hadn't expected to find at all. Not vindication, not even more anger than she already felt. She found, instead, a strange and unwelcome flash of empathy for a woman she should have hated completely, a woman who was, in her own way, also being lied to, also being strung along by the same man, also raising a child alone while believing, or half-believing, or desperately wanting to believe, promises that were never going to come true. That night, Rachel called Daniel while he was still in Tennessee, and she asked him one question: "Who is Melissa Cross?" The silence on the other end of the line lasted, by Rachel's own account, 11 full seconds. She counted them. And in those 11 seconds, Rachel Whitfield understood everything she needed to understand about the last 9 years of her marriage, because a man who is truly confused by a question answers immediately with confusion. A man who has been caught takes 11 seconds to decide how much of the truth he can still get away with denying. "Rachel," Daniel finally said, his voice carefully flat in a way she'd never heard before. "We need to talk when I get home." "We're talking now," Rachel said. Another silence. Then, quietly, in a voice that Rachel would later describe as almost relieved, almost grateful, like a man finally setting down something impossibly heavy he'd been carrying for years, Daniel said, "Her name is Melissa. We have a son together. His name is Adrian. He's 9. Rachel does not remember hanging up the phone. She remembers finding herself sitting on the closet floor sometime later, the phone, both phones, on the carpet beside her, and her daughter Emily's voice on the other line of her own cell phone, having been called by someone, though Rachel would never fully piece together the sequence of who called whom, asking, frantically, "Mom, what's wrong, Mom? Please pick up." 2 days later, Daniel came home. Rachel had, by then, moved her most important documents and a suitcase of clothes to her sister's house 40 minutes away, but she made herself come back to the house that day, sat in the kitchen where she had made breakfast for her children for 20 years, and waited for her husband to walk through the door and explain himself. What Daniel said in that kitchen, the specific words, the exact tone of forced calm, mixed with what almost sounded like relief, would become the single most quoted, most replayed moment in the story Rachel would eventually tell. He did not deny it. He did not apologize. Not at first. Instead, sitting across from the wife of 22 years, the woman who had helped him build a $400 million company from nothing, Daniel Whitfield said, "I never meant to hurt you, Rachel, but I need you to understand. Adrian is my son. He's not going anywhere, and I'm not walking away from him, not even for you." Rachel Whitfield sat in that kitchen, in the house she had built with her own hands and her own decades of sacrifice, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its brutal simplicity, that her marriage was already over. It had been over for years. She had simply been the last one to find out. What she didn't know yet, what none of them knew yet, was that this confession in the kitchen was only the beginning, because buried in the company's financial structure, hidden in trusts and shell accounts Daniel had spent years constructing, was a betrayal even larger than the affair itself. A betrayal that would leave Rachel Whitfield fighting not just for her marriage, but for the very roof over her children's heads. The weeks that followed Daniel's confession in that kitchen were, by Rachel's own account, the darkest of her entire life. Darker even than the years growing up watching her mother cry over unpaid bills, because this darkness came with a particular kind of grief that has no name in most languages. It is not the grief of losing someone to death. It is the grief of realizing the person you loved for over 2 decades may never have fully existed the way you believed him to exist, that you have been, in some fundamental sense, grieving a man who was still very much alive and sitting in the next room. Rachel moved out of the house permanently into her sister Diane's guest bedroom, a space with a twin bed and a dresser that didn't match, a jarring contrast to the 8,000-square-foot home she'd left behind. She told her children the truth, both of them, sitting them down together, because she refused, she said later, to let them hear a softened, careful version designed to protect their father's image. Emily, 22, cried for an hour and then didn't speak to her father for 6 weeks. Caleb, 16, said almost nothing at all, which Rachel found far more frightening than tears, because she remembered, with fresh and specific guilt, that Caleb had tried to tell her something was wrong over a year earlier, and she had dismissed him. The financial reality began revealing itself slowly, and each new revelation felt like a fresh wound layered over one that hadn't yet begun to heal. Patricia Alvarez, Rachel's attorney, discovered that despite Rachel's decades of unpaid labor building the company, despite raising both children largely as a single parent during the years Daniel worked 18-hour days establishing the business, Rachel's name appeared on almost nothing. The house was held in a trust Daniel had created 8 years earlier, a trust with language so carefully constructed that Patricia described it, in a phone call to Rachel, as some of the most defensive estate planning I've seen outside of a Fortune 500 executive. Whitfield Logistics itself, the $400 million company Rachel had helped build with her own hands during its earliest, hungriest years, was structured as a series of holding companies, with Daniel as the sole controlling shareholder. Ohio, being an equitable distribution state rather than a community property state, meant that Rachel's claim to marital assets would depend not on a simple 50-50 split, but on a court's determination of what was fair, a determination that Daniel's team of lawyers, the best money could buy, would fight with everything they had. "He's going to argue," Patricia told Rachel during one particularly brutal meeting, that the company's growth in the last decade was due to his business decisions, his leadership, his risk-taking, not your contributions, which he'll frame as domestic support rather than professional partnership. "It's an old strategy. It's ugly. And I need you to prepare yourself, because it's going to work, unless we can prove otherwise." Rachel remembers sitting in Patricia's office hearing those words and feeling something break open inside her chest, something separate from the grief over Daniel, something that felt, for the first time, less like sadness and more like rage. Because for 22 years, Rachel had told herself that partnership didn't require paperwork, that love and trust were the only contracts that mattered between two people who had built a life together. And now, sitting in a lawyer's office at 50 years old, she was being told that the law, the actual functional law of the state she lived in, might see her not as a co-founder of an empire, but as a well-compensated homemaker with no legal claim to the thing she had helped create. The isolation deepened in ways Rachel hadn't anticipated. Friends she had known for 20 years, women she had sat beside at charity galas and school fundraisers, began, slowly and awkwardly, to pull away. Some, she would later learn, had been quietly warned by Daniel's team that anything they said in support of Rachel could complicate business relationships their own husbands had with Whitfield Logistics. Others simply didn't know what to say to a woman whose entire identity, in their social circle, had been built around being Daniel Whitfield's wife, and now didn't know how to relate to her without that title attached. There was a particular moment, 6 weeks into the separation, that Rachel describes as the loneliest of the entire ordeal. She had gone to the grocery store, an ordinary Tuesday errand she'd done 1,000 times before, and ran into a woman she'd known for 15 years, someone whose children had grown up alongside Emily and Caleb. The woman saw Rachel across the produce section, made brief, unmistakable eye contact, and then turned her cart around and walked the other way. Rachel stood there, in front of a display of oranges, and felt more invisible than she had felt in her entire adult life. Her son Caleb, meanwhile, was struggling in ways that worried Rachel more than her own pain did. He started missing school. His grades, always solid, began slipping. When Rachel finally sat him down and asked him directly what was happening, Caleb said something that Rachel has repeated in interviews many times since, because it captures, more than almost anything else in this story, the particular cruelty of what Daniel's secret had done to an entire family, not just a marriage. "I don't even know if I'm his real son anymore," Caleb said. "Like, if he could do that to you for 9 years, how do I know he's not lying to me too? About everything?" Rachel didn't have an answer for him. She still doesn't. Fully. Even now. What she told Caleb that night, holding him the way she hadn't held him since he was a small child, was the truest thing she could offer. "I don't know what your father is capable of anymore either, but I know what I'm capable of. And I promise you, we are going to be okay, even if I have to prove that to both of us." It was around this time, roughly 2 months after the initial confrontation, that Rachel learned the detail that would harden her resolve more than anything else in the entire ordeal. Through Grace Okafor's continued, quiet investigation, Rachel discovered that Daniel had, 3 years earlier, updated his will and the beneficiary structure of several key trusts to include Adrian, his son with Melissa, as an equal beneficiary alongside Emily and Caleb, without ever informing Rachel that this restructuring had taken place. In doing so, he had, functionally, already begun treating his secret son as a legitimate heir to the Whitfield fortune, years before Rachel ever learned that child existed. This detail, more than the affair itself, more than the lies, more than the years of small deceptions, was the one that finally, completely, extinguished whatever small ember of hope Rachel had been quietly, privately holding on to, that this could somehow be salvaged, that Daniel might still be, underneath everything, a fundamentally good man who had made a terrible, forgivable mistake. Because a mistake is something that happens to you. This was something Daniel had built, deliberately, methodically, over years, weaving his son into the legal architecture of the family's wealth, while keeping that same son's existence entirely hidden from the woman whose decades of labor had made that wealth possible in the first place. Rachel filed for divorce on a Thursday morning in early spring, exactly 4 months after finding the phone in the golf bag. She remembers the specific weather that day, unusually cold for the season, the sky a flat, colorless gray that matched, she said, exactly how she felt inside. Patricia Alvarez had warned her that Daniel's legal team would likely respond aggressively, and they did, within 72 hours, with a countersuit that painted Rachel, in language so cold and clinical that Rachel says she read it 3 times before she could fully absorb what it was saying, as an unemployed spouse with minimal contribution to marital assets beyond traditional domestic responsibilities. It was, Rachel would later say, the single most painful sentence of the entire ordeal, more painful even than the discovery of the affair itself, because it wasn't just Daniel lying to her anymore. It was Daniel, through his lawyers, attempting to legally erase 22 years of her labor, her sacrifice, her partnership, reducing an entire life's work to a phrase designed to minimize her to nothing in the eyes of a judge. Rachel sat alone that night in her sister's guest bedroom, in a twin bed that creaked every time she moved, and made a decision that would define everything that came next in her story. She was not simply going to survive this divorce. She was going to prove, with documents, with witnesses, with every piece of evidence she could gather, exactly what her 22 years had been worth. Not for revenge, though she would admit, later, that revenge was somewhere in the mixture of what drove her. But because she needed, for her own sense of self, for her children watching her, and for every woman who had ever been told that her contribution to a marriage didn't count because her name wasn't on the paperwork, to prove that it did. She had absolutely no idea, sitting in that dark guest room, that the fight ahead of her would uncover secrets even darker than the ones she already knew. Secrets that would ultimately hand her more power in this battle than Daniel Whitfield could possibly imagine. The turning point in Rachel Whitfield's story began, unexpectedly, with a phone call from the very woman Rachel had every reason in the world to hate. It was a Sunday evening, nearly 5 months into the divorce proceedings, when Rachel's cell phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer it. She was exhausted that day, having spent the morning in another deposition with Daniel's lawyers, another round of questions designed to minimize her role in the company's success, and she had promised herself an evening of nothing, just tea and silence in her sister's guest room. But something, some instinct she couldn't name, made her pick up. "Mrs. Whitfield?" The voice on the other end was hesitant, careful. "This is Melissa Cross." Rachel would later describe the feeling of that moment as similar to being submerged suddenly in cold water, a full-body shock that stole her breath before she could form a single word in response. Melissa continued, quickly, as if she'd rehearsed this and needed to get it out before her courage failed. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from. I understand if you hang up, but I think there's something you need to know, and I don't think Daniel is ever going to tell you himself." Rachel didn't hang up. What Melissa told her, over the course of a conversation that lasted nearly 2 hours, would ultimately reshape the entire legal battle ahead, Melissa explained, with what Rachel described as surprising and unexpected honesty, that she had spent 9 years being told the same story Rachel had been living without knowing it. A story where Daniel promised, repeatedly, that he was preparing to leave his marriage, that the timing was never right, that he needed to protect the company first, protect his image, protect his children's inheritance, always some new reason to wait. "I used to feel sorry for you," Melissa admitted, her voice cracking slightly. "Not because I thought I deserved him more, because I realized, somewhere around year 6, that he was never planning to leave either of us completely. He was planning to keep both of us exactly where we were, indefinitely, for as long as it benefited him." But the real reason Melissa had called, the detail that would prove far more consequential than any emotional reckoning between two betrayed women, was financial. Melissa revealed that Daniel had, over the years, made comments to her, casual, careless comments made during moments of frustration with his legal and financial advisors, about the existence of an offshore account structure that predated even his marriage to Rachel by a few years. An account originally set up during the company's early expansion to shelter profits from a joint venture partner Daniel had later pushed out of the business, through, in Melissa's words, some pretty shady maneuvering. "He told me once, when he was drunk after a bad day, that if Rachel ever really came after him in a divorce, he had money nobody could touch. He said it like a joke, but I don't think it was a joke." Rachel brought this information immediately to Patricia Alvarez, who brought in a forensic accountant, a meticulous, soft-spoken man named Robert Kim, who specialized in uncovering exactly this kind of hidden wealth in complex divorce cases. It took Robert nearly 6 weeks of painstaking work, following a trail of shell companies registered in Delaware, then the Cayman Islands, then briefly through a holding company in Luxembourg, before he found what he was looking for. An account, technically owned by a corporate entity with no obvious connection to Daniel Whitfield on paper, holding just under $31 million, funded originally through the very same joint venture buyout Melissa had mentioned, and quietly maintained and grown for over 2 decades without ever appearing on a single marital financial disclosure Daniel had provided to the court. This discovery changed everything, not just because of the money itself, significant as it was, but because concealing marital assets during divorce proceedings is not simply unethical, it is illegal, and the penalties, once proven, can be severe, ranging from the court awarding the wronged spouse the entirety of the hidden assets to, in more extreme cases, criminal referral for fraud. Patricia Alvarez called Rachel the day Robert Kim's report was finalized, and Rachel remembers the specific words her attorney used because they were the first words in nearly 6 months of legal battle that had made her feel something other than despair. "Rachel," Patricia said, "I think we just found our leverage." But the story does not move in a single clean line toward triumph, and Rachel would be the first to say so. Because even as this financial discovery strengthened her legal position enormously, she was still, privately, dealing with the emotional wreckage of the life she had lost. There were nights during this period when she would wake at 3 in the morning in her sister's guest room and for just a fraction of a second, forget everything that had happened, reach across an empty twin bed for a husband who was no longer there, and then remember, all at once, the full weight of it crashing back down. It was during one of these sleepless nights that Rachel made a decision that surprised even her closest friends. She decided to go back to work, not out of financial desperation, since the eventual settlement would ensure she was more than provided for, but because she needed, desperately, to reclaim some part of her identity that existed independently of being Daniel Whitfield's wife. She reached out to an old colleague from her earliest days at the shipping company. Decades earlier, a woman named Teresa who had gone on to start her own logistics consulting firm, and asked, tentatively, if there was any way she could be useful. Teresa, it turned out, needed exactly what Rachel had spent 22 years quietly developing without ever putting a formal title to it: an expert in operational scaling, in the specific, hard-won knowledge of how to grow a small logistics company into a large one, knowledge Rachel had absorbed not from a textbook, but from living through every single stage of that growth herself, side by side with the man who eventually tried to claim, in a legal document, that her contribution had been merely domestic. Rachel started as a part-time consultant, reviewing operational plans for Teresa's smaller clients, companies at the exact stage Whitfield Logistics had been decades earlier. Within 3 months, her insight, precise, practical, earned through real experience rather than theory, had helped one of Teresa's clients avoid a costly expansion mistake that would have cost them nearly $2 million. Word began to spread, quietly, within the tight-knit world of Midwest logistics companies, about a woman who seemed to understand the entire life cycle of building a trucking empire from the inside out. For the first time in over 2 decades, Rachel Whitfield was being valued, professionally and financially, for her own knowledge and her own name, not as an extension of her husband's success, but as her own person entirely. She remembers the specific, quiet pride of receiving her first consulting check under her own name, deposited into an account that had nothing to do with Daniel Whitfield at all, and how she sat in her car in the bank parking lot afterward and cried, not from sadness this time, but from something that felt, tentatively, unfamiliar and wonderful, like relief. Meanwhile, The divorce case was building toward what Patricia Alvarez described as an inevitable confrontation. With the hidden offshore account now documented and verified, with Melissa Cross having agreed, somewhat remarkably, to provide a sworn statement about Daniel's comments regarding the account, and with growing evidence of Rachel's substantial, continuous professional contribution to the company's early success, through old emails, invoices she had personally processed, and testimony from former employees who remembered exactly how involved she had been, Daniel Whitfield's legal position was crumbling in ways his team hadn't anticipated. Daniel requested a private meeting with Rachel, through their attorneys, roughly 7 months into the proceedings. It would take place not in a courtroom, but in a neutral conference room, just the two of them, along with their respective lawyers present but largely silent. An opportunity, Daniel's attorney suggested, for a possible resolution before the case proceeded to what would undoubtedly become a very public, very damaging trial. Rachel almost didn't go. Part of her, the part still raw from months of grief and humiliation, wanted nothing more than to see this play out in the most public, consequential way possible. Wanted the world to know exactly what kind of man Daniel Whitfield had been for 9 hidden years. But another part of her, the practical part, that had spent 22 years quietly, methodically building things, understood that this meeting represented something important, an opportunity not just for a settlement, but for the truth, the full truth, to finally be spoken out loud between the two of them, without lawyers softening every sentence into legal language designed to protect rather than reveal. She agreed to the meeting, and what happened in that conference room, the confrontation Rachel had been building toward without fully realizing it for the better part of a year, would become the moment everything she had endured, everything she had lost and rebuilt, finally came to its reckoning. The conference room was on the 14th floor of a downtown office building Rachel had never visited before. All glass walls and cold gray carpet, the kind of sterile corporate space designed to strip emotion out of even the most emotional conversations. Rachel arrived 10 minutes early, sat alone at the long table with Patricia Alvarez beside her, and watched through the glass as Daniel walked in, flanked by his lead attorney, looking, Rachel would say later, older than she'd ever seen him look. Not physically older in some deeper way, the way a person looks when the weight of consequence has finally, fully landed on them. For the first 20 minutes, the conversation proceeded exactly as these meetings usually do. Lawyers speaking in careful, measured language about asset division, about the newly discovered offshore account, about proposed settlement figures. Rachel sat mostly silent, watching Daniel's face as Patricia laid out, methodically and without a trace of anger in her voice, the full scope of what they had discovered. The $31 million, Melissa's sworn statement, the pattern of financial concealment stretching back over 2 decades. Rachel watched something break in Daniel's face when Patricia mentioned Melissa's statement specifically. Not surprise. Rachel realized, watching him, that he had probably suspected Melissa might eventually turn against him, somewhere in the back of his mind, in the same way a person suspects a structure they've built on unstable ground might eventually collapse. What broke in his face wasn't surprise. It was the specific pain of finally, fully understanding that every person he had tried to control through careful, compartmentalized deception had, eventually, escaped that control entirely. It was Daniel who asked, abruptly, interrupting his own attorney mid-sentence, if he could speak to Rachel directly, without the lawyers guiding every word. Patricia looked at Rachel, a silent question in her eyes, and Rachel, after a long pause, nodded. What followed was not the confrontation Rachel had imagined in her darkest, angriest moments over the previous 7 months. She had imagined screaming. She had imagined, in her most human and least generous moments, wanting to see Daniel Whitfield completely destroyed, humiliated, brought as low as she had felt in that closet holding a stranger's phone. What actually happened was quieter, and in its own way, far more devastating for Daniel than any screaming match could have been. "I keep trying to understand how I got here," Daniel said, his voice low, and Rachel noted, with the clear-eyed distance of someone who had spent months healing from the initial wound, that even now, even in this moment, some part of him was still performing, still searching for the version of the story where he could remain, in some way, sympathetic. "I never planned for any of this to happen the way it did." "You planned every single piece of it," Rachel said, and her voice, she remembers, was remarkably steady, steadier than she expected it to be. "You planned the shell company. You planned the trust that excluded me. You planned 9 years of excuses to a woman who was raising your son without you. None of this happened to you, Daniel. You built it, the same way you built the company, brick by brick, on purpose." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that Rachel has repeated many times since, in interviews, in conversations with her therapist, in late-night talks with her sister, because it captured, more precisely than anything else he said that day, the fundamental selfishness at the center of everything that had happened. "I thought if I never had to choose between you and her, I'd never have to lose either of you. I told myself that was protecting everyone." "You weren't protecting anyone," Rachel said. "You were protecting yourself from having to be honest. That's all this ever was." There was a silence after that, a long one, and Rachel remembers watching Daniel's face during it, watching him arrive, finally and fully, at an understanding he had clearly been avoiding for years. Not just the understanding that he had hurt her, though he seemed, in that moment, to genuinely grasp the depth of that for perhaps the first time, but a colder, more practical understanding as well, that the empire he had spent 30 years building, the empire his secrecy had been designed in part to protect, was now going to be divided in a way that reflected the full truth of who had actually built it. Because that is precisely what happened next. With the offshore account fully documented, with the concealment of marital assets legally established, and with mounting evidence, including sworn testimony from 3 former Whitfield Logistics employees, confirming Rachel's substantial and continuous role in the company's foundational growth during its first critical decade, Patricia Alvarez was able to negotiate a settlement that would have been unthinkable 7 months earlier, when Daniel's lawyers had dismissed Rachel's contributions as merely domestic. The final settlement awarded Rachel 42% of the marital estate, a figure Patricia described as unusually favorable given Ohio's equitable distribution laws, made possible almost entirely by the leverage created through the discovery of the hidden offshore account and the credibility Rachel's professional testimony had established. It included the family home, which Rachel would ultimately choose to sell, unable to live any longer in the house where she had learned the truth. It included a substantial cash settlement, and critically, it included a negotiated equity stake in Whitfield Logistics itself, 5% of the company Rachel had helped build from a single delivery truck, a stake worth, by the company's most recent valuation, well over $18 million. Daniel did not fight the equity stake, though his lawyers advised him to. Rachel would later learn, through a conversation with Melissa Cross, that had, surprisingly, continued in the months following the divorce, that Daniel had told his attorneys, quietly, privately, "Let her have it. She earned every piece of that company, more than I ever gave her credit for." It was, Rachel says, the closest thing to a genuine apology she would ever receive from him. Not words spoken directly to her, but an action taken when he had every opportunity to fight harder, and chose, for reasons she still doesn't fully understand and has largely stopped trying to understand, not to. The consequences for Daniel extended beyond the financial settlement. The story of his hidden second family, once details began circulating within the tight business community where Whitfield Logistics operated, damaged his reputation in ways that no amount of money could immediately repair. Two major retail clients, uncomfortable with the public scrutiny and the ongoing legal proceedings, quietly began transitioning their contracts to competing logistics firms. The regional business magazine that had once profiled him as a rising star of Midwest entrepreneurship published a follow-up piece, considerably less flattering, examining the pattern of financial concealment uncovered during the divorce. His relationship with his children suffered the most lasting damage. Emily, 23 by the time the settlement was finalized, maintained only minimal formal contact with her father, communicating primarily through brief messages around holidays. Caleb, 17 and preparing for college, made a decision that broke something in Daniel that even the financial losses hadn't managed to break. He chose to attend a university in a different state than the one Daniel had attended, studying a field entirely unrelated to logistics or business. A quiet but unmistakable declaration of a young man determined to build an identity separate from his father's legacy, and everything that legacy had come to represent. Melissa Cross and her son Adrian, meanwhile, entered a strange new chapter of their own. With the affair no longer hidden, Daniel did, finally, acknowledge Adrian publicly. A decision that came with its own complicated consequences, including a separate legal process establishing custody arrangements and child support, and including, eventually, a tentative, careful relationship beginning to form between Adrian and his half-siblings, Emily and Caleb, who found themselves, against all expectation, drawn to curiosity rather than resentment toward a 9-year-old boy who had, after all, done nothing wrong in any of this. Rachel herself, in the months following the settlement, made the decision that would come to define the final chapter of her transformation, using a portion of her settlement, combined with the professional reputation she had quietly rebuilt through her consulting work with Teresa's firm. She launched her own logistics consulting company, specifically focused on helping mid-sized, family-owned trucking and shipping businesses navigate the exact kind of rapid growth that had once transformed Whitfield Logistics from 3 trucks into an empire. She named the company Whitfield Rising Consulting, a deliberate choice, she has said in interviews since, not out of spite toward Daniel, but as a reclamation. That name, Rachel said, represents 22 years of my own work. I wasn't going to let him take the meaning of it away from me, along with everything else. Within 18 months, Whitfield Rising Consulting had contracts with 11 mid-sized companies across 4 states, and Rachel Whitfield, once described in a legal filing as a woman whose contribution to a $400 million company amounted to little more than traditional domestic responsibilities, was being invited to speak at regional business conferences about the exact expertise those same filings had once tried to erase. Rachel Whitfield is 54 years old now, 3 years removed from the night she sat on her closet floor holding a stranger's phone. She lives in a smaller home than the one she once shared with Daniel, a home she chose herself, decorated entirely according to her own taste for the first time in her adult life, without a single decision made to accommodate anyone else's preferences. She says, when she talks about it now, that there is a particular kind of peace in a house that reflects nothing but yourself, a peace she didn't know she was missing for over 2 decades. Her relationship with her children has deepened in ways she couldn't have predicted during those darkest months. Emily, now 26, works alongside her mother at Whitfield Rising Consulting, having discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, the same instinct for operational strategy that had once made Rachel indispensable to a company she never officially owned. Caleb, 20, calls his mother every Sunday without fail, a small ritual neither of them has ever needed to discuss out loud, both of them understanding, without saying it, exactly what that consistency means after everything the family endured. Rachel and Daniel maintain what she describes as a functional, distant civility, primarily for the sake of their children and, increasingly, for the sake of a relationship that has cautiously, tentatively grown between Emily, Caleb, and their half-brother Adrian, now 12 years old. Rachel has met Adrian exactly twice, both times at events organized by her own children rather than by Daniel, and she has said, with a generosity that surprises even her, that she feels no anger toward the boy himself. He didn't choose any of this, she says. None of us chose it. Some of us just had more power to prevent it than others. If there is a single lesson Rachel Whitfield wants people to take from her story, it is not really about betrayal, though betrayal is, undeniably, at the center of everything that happened to her. It is about the specific danger of building a life so completely intertwined with another person that you forget to protect your own name, your own claim, your own place in the story of what you built together. I loved my husband, she says now, without bitterness, though not without a certain hard-won clarity. That love was real. But love without protection isn't partnership. It's just faith. And faith alone can't hold up a house when the person you trusted decides to take the foundation out from under you. She has become, somewhat unexpectedly, an advocate for women in long-term marriages, particularly those who, like her, spent decades contributing to a family's wealth and success without ever formalizing that contribution on paper. She speaks now, at conferences and in interviews, about the importance of financial literacy within marriage, about the quiet, unglamorous work of understanding exactly what you're entitled to, exactly what your name is or isn't attached to, long before you ever hope you'll need that knowledge. What Rachel's story ultimately reveals, more than anything else, is that the people who hurt us most rarely announce themselves as villains from the beginning. They build their betrayals slowly, patiently, often while continuing to say and do things that feel, in the moment, like love, and the strength required to survive that kind of betrayal, to rebuild an entire life and an entire sense of self from the wreckage of it, doesn't come from anger alone. It comes from the same quiet, methodical discipline that built the life in the first place. The discipline Rachel had been using for decades without ever fully recognizing its value until she was forced to use it for herself, and only herself, for the very first time. So here is the question I want to leave you with tonight. If you discovered tomorrow that the person you trusted most in the world had been living a second, hidden life for years, would you have the strength to walk away and rebuild, or would the fear of losing everything you'd built together keep you standing in a house that was never fully yours to begin with? Rachel Whitfield found her answer in a golf bag, in a sock, In a phone with 3 letters saved as a contact, what would you do if you found yours? If this story moved you, if you felt something in Rachel's journey from silence to strength, take a moment to subscribe, because there are more stories like this one still to come. Real stories about betrayal, resilience, and the quiet, extraordinary power of rebuilding a life on your own terms. Thank you for staying with me until the very end.